Dr. Carson, thanks for joining me on Afterwards.
It's my pleasure.
Your book, Martin's Dream, is a memoir and a history book. In the book, you talk about your personal journey, and you're very candid about your life. And you also cover new insights as a historian to the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What prompted you to write the book this way?
Well, I wanted to write something to mark the 50th anniversary, and I realized that this is 50 years of my life, that it's King's legacy and his life coincides with my coming of age. Mm-hmm. So part of it was to do those two tasks. I felt that my life had been connected to the King legacy, and yet I felt that there was something about my life that needed to be told in order to understand how King impacted me, and how I got involved in this amazing journey of editing King's papers.
Well, it's an excellent read, and you and I are of the same generation, and I too was coming of age in the 60s. And the book, I must say, was bittersweet for me because, I guess sweet because I knew Dr. King. He was my mentor. I knew him the last 2 years of his life. And bitter because of the way he was taken from us, because of racial hatred in this country. And I don't know, I guess we can start at the beginning, because at the beginning of your book, you're on the Mall with Dr. King, and near the end of your book, you're on the Mall again, 50 years later, with his monument, which you helped to design.
And in between, coming back so many times on important occasions to the Mall. So it seems like even though I only lived in Washington for a short time, the Mall seemed to be a place that had such great symbolic meaning for my life.
And sentimental.
And sentimental, yes.
Well.
Every time I come back, I have all these memories.
It's a beautiful city. You were 19 years old in 1963. You were on the Mall, the March on Washington, where Dr. King gave that iconic address, I Have a Dream. How did you happen to go there?
Well, part of it is that I grew up in a small town where there weren't very many black people. I think there were 3 black families growing up in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And so I'd always been fascinated by what was the black community like. You know, I didn't have very much exposure to it, except on visits to my relatives in Detroit. So I think I learned about the black community through the black freedom struggle. I'd pick up my newspaper, and there is Martin Luther King, there are the Little Rock Nine, there are the students in the sit-ins, and they became my role models. So by 1963, I'm in college. I get to go to this student meeting, National Student Association meeting in Indianapolis,
which is my hometown, by the way.
At Bloomington, actually, and I meet Stokely Carmichael, and you know, he's the first person in SNCC I talked to, and I remember when I told him that I wanted to go to the march, and he just kind of dismissed that, and you know, how could you think about just going to that picnic?
Why? Was he a detractor of Dr. King or his methods?
Not so much. You know, he didn't say that in terms of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was just one of the people who were going to be at the march. I think it was just that for me, he felt that I should be in Albany, Georgia, and Cambridge, Maryland, and you know, he was at Howard University at the time. So he would be going to these places where there's activism
and danger.
So going to a one-day march just was not what he had in mind, and I think he was trying to recruit me into the movement. But for me, going to a one-day march would be the most exciting and radical thing I'd done in my life at that point.
I want to talk more about Stokely, but let's go back to the march. To be there when he gives that address, what did you think of the speech? Did you think it would be iconic like the Gettysburg Address or FDR's Day of Infamy?
Oh no, not at that point. I mean, for those of us who were there, it was the final speech in a long day of speeches. So yes, I was very pleased to see Martin Luther King in person. I had heard about him, and everyone kind of looked forward to, well, what was going to Martin Luther King say, because he was already then known as this great orator. But his speech was very short. It wasn't one of his, long-winded, often he spoke for an hour or so.
Typically Baptist preacher.
And this is 15, 16 minutes. And it actually was planned to be less. It was planned to be about 7, 8 minutes. That was what he actually wrote out his speech
to be.
Why
was it longer? Did he decide to add the tell that story?
Well, one of the things I found out later, but I didn't know then, was that when he got to the end of his prepared remarks, he thought, oh, this occasion requires something more. He had kind of laid out his agenda. And now I can look at his advanced text and see he reaches the end and he's talking about go back to the South, go back to all these places, continue the protest. But then he thought the occasion required something more.
More gravitas.
And he had been talking about this dream that he had had. He had talked about it for years, the American dream, and then it had become his dream. And he had been in Detroit just a few months before, and he had talked about, I have a dream, and that America will someday realize these principles in the Declaration of Independence. So I think he was just inspired by that moment.
In our group, there was talk that Mahalia Jackson, who was there, was egging him on, saying,
Tell him about your
dream.
Yes. But, one of the things I found, I've listened to lots of recordings of that speech. I've never quite heard that. Now, maybe she kind of allowed stage whisper to him, that I want to believe that story because it just sounds so
She
great.
loved him.
Yes, she
The
did.
reason I met Dr. King is because I was staying at her home in Chicago as a young girl when I was working for Ebony Magazine. And Dr. King would come by there. As a matter of fact, I met him the day after he was hit in the head at Gage Park. Remember the story?
Right.
You talk about it in the book about his being hit in the head at Gage Park in Cicero, Illinois. Did you meet him? Did you meet Dr. King?
I only saw him from a distance. He was always...
How close were you?
Well, I tried to get as close as I could, but so I got to the foot of the Lincoln Memorial, but the notion as a 19-year-old that I would actually even shake hands with him, that would have been the thrill of my life. I only saw him speak twice. And both times I just saw him as a member of a crowd.
Where else did you see him?
He came to UCLA when I was a student there and spoke. And so that was the other time. It was maybe 1965, something like that.
How did that impact you on the way home? You had this long journey on the way home. It was,
yes, I didn't have a ride back. I didn't tell my parents I was coming, and I had a bus ticket that only went back to Indianapolis. And so then I just had to hitchhike, and I hitchhiked across the country.
Were you scared?
Of course. I mean, but as a 19-year-old, you think you can do everything.
You think you're invincible.
Yes, right. And
how did hearing Dr. King's speech that day impact you on how Stokely was trying to influence you? Did you, because you talked to Stokely afterwards?
Yeah, well, no, before.
Did you talk to him again?
Not afterwards. It was probably 3 years before I talked with him again. By that time, he had become, in 1963, he was not a well-known public figure. 1966, he's the advocate of Black Power, and so that's when the next time we got back in touch with each other again. And from that point on, I kind of stayed in touch with him for the rest of his life.
We want to talk about him some more, because Stokely Carmichael was one of my heroes, as well as Malcolm X. I was more in agreement with the Malcolm X, the later Malcolm X, and Stokely Carmichael than I was with Dr. King, despite knowing him. And later, as I've gotten older, I appreciate Dr. King's tactics. He is the one with the monument on the mall.
Yes.
But during that time, you had some misgivings about Time magazine naming Dr. King Man of the Year. What was...
Oh, no, not at all. I mean, I was, from a distance, very proud of Martin Luther King. But I think I kind of absorbed a lot of SNCC's resentment of him, that the people in Snake and I kind of felt this way. Martin Luther King is following us. We're not following him. He's the one who, we're out there trying to break new ground in terms of, for me, it was moving to Los Angeles and getting involved in the movement there and getting involved with a group called the Nonviolent Action Committee, which was kind of a SNCC group at the local level, getting involved with issues like employment issues and urban issues. And this is a year before King comes to Chicago. So we're already, so from our perspective, oh yes, King is following
catching
us
up.
and catching up. The same on the Vietnam War. That we were very involved in opposing the war from an early stage, and King was much more cautious in that because he knew he had much more to lose than
And
than
he
we
lost a lot, didn't he?
did. Yes, yeah.
And being against the Vietnam War.
Yeah, one of the things I discovered is that it's much easier for a 20 or 21-year-old student to take a stand on anything. You don't have anything to lose, except maybe your draft status, which I did lose. So for King, though, he understood that everything that he had accomplished on the civil rights agenda, his access to the White House and to Congress, all of that was contingent on not taking a stand on Vietnam.
President Johnson was very upset with Dr. King for the stand he took, because he felt, I've given you, not given you, but we've handed civil rights and voting rights over.
Yes.
And now you're going to go against me as I'm up for re-election. You're going to go against me on the Vietnam War.
Yes. Yeah, that didn't, King, now I understand what courage it took to take the stand that he did. And I understand more about why he hesitated. Coretta didn't hesitate. Coretta was very much involved in the anti-war movement from an earlier stage. But again, she was not the public figure. So he could send her to essentially speak for him.
And again, history proves Dr. King right.
I think so. I think that this is one of the ways in which I think he's a visionary. I think he understood the connection between the anti-colonial movements that were going on around the world, and understood how the Cold War had prevented us from seeing that we were on the wrong side. That because the communist movement had identified itself with anti-colonialism, many of these nationalists wanted to have the assistance of the Soviet Union. So we saw it entirely in Cold War terms. If the Soviet Union is for it, we were opposed to it.
My enemy's enemy is my friend.
That's right.
You left the country during the Vietnam era.
Yes.
Why?
Well, for me, looking back, it wasn't that difficult a choice because I knew I wasn't going to go into the military.
How did you know you weren't going to go? Weren't you drafted?
I was drafted several times, actually. I appealed it and tried to be a conscientious objector, and that was turned down. So it was really coming down to, do I want to go to prison for 3 years, or do I want to explore the world? So I recognized that if I left, I might not be able to ever come back. And that was the big decision.
I was going to say, when I was reading your book, I thought that is a decision between your life and your life, living your life outside of your country and being castigated.
That's right. That was that's what I had to really think through. And
your father was a military man. He had served in World War II.
In fact, he was an officer in the Army Reserve, and it reached the rank of lieutenant colonel. And so for him, the military had offered opportunity. He had been mired in the Depression and gets drafted. And because the military needed black officers, as a draftee, he's able to go to officer training school and has opportunities within the military that he never had in civilian life. So
it wouldn't have been the same for you had you
I thought about that, actually, when I was a nominee to the Air Force Academy in West Point. So I could easily have seen how my life might have gone in a very different direction.
Couldn't you have done what your brother Michael and my brother James did? They joined the Navy so they could avert the draft. Did you think about that? Did you discuss it with Michael, your brother?
I thought about that, but by that time I was very politicized, and I would have felt guilty that I was taking the easy way out. I think I knew that I could have gone into the military and I wouldn't have been sent to the front lines. I might have been sent not even to Vietnam, but by that time it was more the symbolism of it. I knew that I did not want to support that war.
You know, a lot of young people our age, black people our age at that time, had difficulty reconciling our not having all the rights that whites had, and then serving this country, taking a risk on our life. Muhammad Ali.
If I was going to fight for democracy, I would have done it in Mississippi and Alabama. I didn't have to go 10,000 miles to fight for democracy.